later on between the adepts and the Black Brothers of the left-hand path. And Crowley's way of putting it was that they shut themselves up because they're afraid of death, and they're trying to flee from the natural processes of the world, and therefore they fall off the tree of life, essentially. I actually like the way that Levi puts it better. He says, the difference between a magician and a sorcerer is the magician holds onto the tree while he saws off the branch, while the sorcerer hangs off the branch while he saws it. How's he put it exactly? Yes, the magician clings to the tree when he cuts off the branch, while the sorcerer hangs from the very branch he tries to cut off. Yeah, it sounds way better. And yes, it's very possible to abuse these kind of natural sympathies in that way. And this is the reason for the virtue part, where people kind of criticize Crowley for being the wickedest man in the world, doing all these drugs, having all this sex, walking around like the early 1900s David Bowie, basically, of his time. But realistically, he was doing all this in the name of holiness and godliness, and that's how he saw it. And it's a matter of destroying those sort of mastering the passions, as Levi puts it. So really he's directly taking it off Levi. But although, I couldn't imagine Levi doing anything remotely of the kind, he was still very grounded in Christian morality. As far as we know, and this is kind of the interesting thing, there's, when I talk about the subtext in Levi's work, there's a few times, what was that passage I quoted to you before, about where he's talking about how to invoke the devil, all one must do is dress oneself up as the devil and look in the mirror, and that automatically does it. And he says, to do this is to awaken the beast in man. And then he says, at the end, there's just a cryptic remark about how there's a Kabbalistic second meaning to this. And I think that's very interesting, considering Crowley, considering himself to be the reincarnation of Levi, was called by his guardian angel, the beast, and considered to be manifesting the apocalypse. There's a few times that Levi makes these very cryptic remarks about Kabbalistic interpretations of different things, doctrines that we would conventionally consider to be evil, but he may not have interpreted that way. And I think that without the knowledge of what exact mystery school Levi was initiated into, it's very difficult to draw any conclusions there. So it's all a big question mark. But it's interesting to think about these questions, and to study his work, one should think about these questions, because it makes life interesting. And Lord knows we don't want to be bored. This is kind of where the great secret comes in, and I think that to really get an idea of what Levi's trying to talk about when he talks, because it's easy to get waylaid by the Christian symbolism in Levi's work. Not that I think Christian symbolism is bad, it's just it doesn't fit everyone's paradigm necessarily. Crowley's Liber 175, or Liber Asarte, is probably the best place to look at that seriously, because this is the book where he talks about how to, it's essentially bhakti yoga, where one invokes a god through pure devotion. And he goes through the whole system of how you have to, make sure that your diet changes to be specific to the god that you're trying to invoke, like your mode of dress, your way of speaking, every minor, tiny little detail of your life has to go towards reminding yourself of that God that you're trying to make that connection with. And that's pretty much what, this acts on the same fundamental principle that Levi's talking about when he's talking about the astral light. Essentially what makes every little part of your life into a sort of mini ritual to get closer to that idea or that spirit or whatever one's trying to invoke. Levi, like I said, uses the sort of animals as an analogy, which is a fair analogy to use, but I think the Golden Dawn way of kind of connecting it to the Egyptian gods makes it gives it a lot more resonance, because then you can kind of look at the myths associated with those gods and get more meaning out of it. And really, ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what this is about, is packing as much meaning as possible into every little gesture, so that one's world sort of opens up. There's a great, the analogy I would use here is to people who know more than one language. If you know different languages, then you can take the same word and it can mean several different things with slightly different connotations every time, and you get more out of thinking about that concept or that word or that idea just because you can translate it into a couple of different ideas into your head. That's what this is really about. When Levy's talking about how to do this, he said, there's one point where he's like, all right, people are saying, this isn't really magic, you're just talking about, how to behave or whatever, and what about talismans, what about wands, what about the magical dagger and all this stuff, and he's like, yes, I've written about these things before. This is interesting. This actually occurs in the book The Great Secret, which was published after his death. He says, yes, I've written about these things, and you do them, and they are important, but they're not the point. The point is, your whole, if they don't mean anything to you, if you don't comport yourself correctly, if you just kind of do the ritual and say the god names and then, go about your life the same way that you would always have gone about your life, then it's not gonna do too much. It's not gonna help you. What this should be doing is changing you, not just in what you get out of it as a result of the ritual, but in how you behave and how you conduct yourself, because those are the things that actually will create lasting change. And that's where Crowley later comes up in the intro to Magic and Theory and Practice. I'll get to that. He defines magic as creating change and conformity with will, and that's a succinct way of putting it, and it sounds like a glib sort of toss-off slogan, but it's definitely worth thinking about that. And it's easy to say, but it's not so easy to really comprehend. Crowley actually wrote Magic and Theory and Practice as a reflection of Levy's doctrine and ritual of transcendental magic, in the same sense that the individual chapters are connected to the trumps of the tarot. Levy's work was translated, as I said before, mostly by Arthur Waite. Key of the Mysteries, which is his book on which is a radical reformulation of how to interpret the Bible, was translated by Crowley, which is key because Crowley actually did his own radical reformulation of how to interpret the Bible in his Liber 418, which you can see if you read Key of the Mysteries, there are a lot of synchronicities there, and it's a really excellent discussion of how to use the Kabbalah. And I'm not going to give you a book report. It's online. You can read it for free. But that's the one where Crowley sort of opens up just by being pissed off about the Waite translations, and he very strongly, basically he says, Waite is incapable of writing in French or English, so the fact that he would write these things is ridiculous. And he's kind of right. I think he's a little too harsh, but at the same time, he does have a point. And also, Waite, this is the key point. Waite was invested in hiding what he saw as Levy trying to reveal too much, or to reveal things that should not be revealed. So he messes with things. Like he messes with the order of the chapters at one point. He messes with the order of Levy's tarot. He messes with, when Levy reprints Agrippa's squares, there's only one square that he actually could mess with, but he did mess with it, which is the Mercury square. There's a point where he transposes the numbers. It works. The way Agrippa's squares work is that if you take a square number, essentially if you line them up in rows and columns, each row and column will add up to the same thing. He messes with the Mercury square to the point at which they still add up to the same thing, because the difference between the numbers he transposes is the same, but you can tell that it's fucked up because if you trace the numbers in sequence from 1 to 64, you will see a very clear image, and it's the same with all the squares. There will be like a clear image if you trace the numbers in order, and if you want to know if the square you've got is right, then that's all you have to do to tell if it's correct, because it will be, what's the word I want, where both sides look the same?
Symmetry?
Yes, symmetrical. Thank you. Brain, make words. Anyway, yeah.